President Biden responding to pressure to drop out of the presidential race with a letter to congressional Democrats this morning. This comes after a handful of Democrats have called on the president to step aside as the presumptive Democratic nominee. For more on the state of the race, we want to bring in Greg Valliere. He's AGF Investments, a chief U.S. policy strategist. Greg, it's great to see you. So it's been, about a week and a half since we last spoke. And when I last talked to you, we were discussing about whether or not, or the likelihood that maybe we could see the Democratic Party nominate another candidate if President Biden were to step aside. But here we stand this morning, and at least taking a look at that letter from President Biden to congressional Democrats, it doesn't look like he has any plans to do so. Should he, though?
I think it's going to be a process that will last a while longer. I don't think we're at any kind of resolution yet. He's got a big press conference on Thursday, as you know. He's got the G10 meeting here in Washington for the next 3 days. So I think people will watch him very, very carefully without making any decision. This could drag on until the Democrats' convention in Chicago in mid-August.
Greg, would that be the final moment in this question of whether or not he is officially going to be on that ballot in November, or could we continue to see questions about it even after that?
It could be the latter. I got to tell you, I think if Biden makes another gaffe or says something that upsets people, at some point he's going to have to go. So I'm not positive that he is going to make it. I think in the last 48 hours, maybe the pendulum has shifted a little bit toward him, but we're still a long, long way to go. And I got to tell you, the big concern among Democrats on Capitol Hill is quite clear. They think they could lose the House, the Senate, the White House, and lots of governorships. That would be a bloodbath for the Democrats, and that's a plausible scenario if he is still on the ticket.
Greg, give me a number here quickly. What percentage chance would you put on Biden not being on the ticket come November?
I'm going to stick to my guns. It's one of the most difficult calls in my career, but I think the chances are better than 50-50 that he will not be on the ticket, that Kamala Harris at some point in the fall will wind up on the ticket.
Is she the best option for the Democrats at this point?
Oh, yeah, they have to take her. I think it would infuriate African-American Democrats, female Democrats. So she would be the replacement. I think a lot of people have gotten a little bit more excited by her. But again, I would reiterate, this is not over yet. And Biden's not out of the woods, but it could be weeks and weeks before we get a clarity on who is the nominee.
Well, Greg, I think the question here is, what do you think is going to get President Biden to step aside in this race? And is it one particular lawmaker? Is it someone that comes out and says that publicly that he should step aside, that is going to make him change his mind?
Good question. I think, maybe if Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi come out together and say he has to step down, that would have clout. Maybe if Biden's polls really took a slide. His polls are off a little, but they're not horrible compared to a month or so ago. Maybe he has another episode where he freezes up and doesn't appear to know what the answer is. So there are lots of things that could happen that could change this. But I'd say the polls in particular, especially the polls for the Senate and the House, because you've got a lot of really nervous senators and House members.
Yeah, well, you had President Biden sending a letter to congressional Democrats this morning saying that he does still believe he is the best candidate to beat President Trump. And the first policy he cites in that letter is his economic policy, talking about adding jobs, his economic vision. Who do you think is better for this economy, Trump or Biden?
Biden. I think his proposals have worked pretty well. I think a lot of what Trump is going to be doing would add to inflation. Trump wants a big fat tax cut. I'm not sure we need a big fat tax cut. Both of them want tariffs, which I think is a dumb idea. But I think when you look at the two of them together, I'd say that Biden has had a pretty good run. He's done fairly well on the economy, and I think that he would lead Trump eventually on that subject.
And Greg, let's talk a little bit more about those tax cuts, because I think initially investors are looking at that saying, hey, that this could actually be a good thing here for the markets, especially when you take into account maybe what the Republicans want to do when it comes to the corporate tax rate. And there has been talk, there has been push within that party to lower the corporate tax rate all the way down to 15%. Why should this bring some pause for investors there when you talk about it adding to the deficit right now, higher debt? Why is that so problematic in your view?
I'd cite two reasons. Number one, I'm not sure the economy needs a tax cut right now. We did 4 years ago, and we got one that had been too big. But the big thing that I think the markets are going to have to start worrying about is paying for it. I mean, an extension of the Trump tax cuts that passed in 2017, if we extend them for another decade, we're talking $4 or $5 trillion. I'm not sure we have the money for another big tax cut.
What does that mean for Wall Street then? Which of these potential candidates is better for investors, institutional investors?
Yeah, good question. I think as long as Jerome Powell sticks around, the Wall Street will be happy. Unfortunately, Powell and Trump do not get along, as you know. And I think if there's real friction between the two and Powell leaves, his term doesn't expire till the end of 2026. But I think friction between Powell and Trump would not be well received by the markets.
Greg, I'm curious from your view, because we've heard, and there's been lots of coverage on this over the last week and a half, about donors now starting to pressure and starting to speak about President Biden stepping aside. How closely does President Biden and the administration look at this? How much weight do they actually have in what is ultimately going to happen?
Yeah, I think that, well, both of them have a ton of money. No, they're not going to be scrounging around for loose change. They've got plenty of money. But I think that if one of the candidates, probably Biden, tends to see a decrease of fundraising, that's not a good sign. I think that's a sign that he is losing confidence with the financial community, with Silicon Valley. There are a lot of sources of money that could dry up, and that would not look good for Biden.
All right, Greg Valliere, AGF Investments, Chief U.S. Policy Strategist, thanks so much for making the time to join us here.